Hey everybody, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I'm joined once again with Marina from Dating Beyond Borders. Welcome.
Hey guys.
And in this video, we want to go into specifically what are some differences of like raising kids or how Swedish people parent their kids versus other countries and what are some like unique aspects about that. This is a follow-up to our last video we did about dating. So if you manage to be with a Swede long enough to have kids maybe before you get married, well, what can you expect? What are some differences, Marina? Tell us.
Well, I think the one of the main things about Scandinavian culture in general is the idea of don't be better than anybody else, right? Whereas I would say that's changing nowadays, but parts of it are still ingrained. So for example, if a kid is doing really well, you're not going to be like, you're the best, go. Like the kid is going to be asked to tutor another kid, right? Like so they can bring him up, and it's like teamwork and it's
Mm,
working together. So there's if you look at Sweden, like there's no gift schools. That doesn't exist there. Like, oh, your kid is better, they should go to a special school. Like, no,
yeah.
everyone's the same. But I think also it's the idea of you trust your kid as an individual. You're not like a helicopter parent where you're just like running around like, oh no, little Jackie, don't fall in. Be careful, hold my hand. I think for a lot of like Scandinavian parents, like the parenting comes down to, okay, let the kid run around, let them fall down, let them, get themselves dirty. They're gonna learn from that. They're gonna become an individual. Like they're gonna be self-sufficient because that's the huge thing is becoming a self-sufficient individual, right? So
Yeah.
since childhood, I would say that's how the kids are raised. In Denmark, I heard of like in schools you can even use like real life tools or you'll cook with like a knife, and even like Danish parents, they will bring their kids to see if like an animal is killed because they'll be like, know what, you're eating the meat, so you're going to watch how this animal is killed so you know exactly what you're eating. It's
Wow.
pretty dark, but it's kind of like the idea of like talking to the kid like they're an adult. And if the kid does something wrong, you're not going to be like, go to the corner, go to the, go sit there and wait and your playtime is canceled. It'll be like, no, let's talk about this.
Hmm.
You
Interesting.
know, it's so interesting. I was listening to a podcast by Kay Mellish, I think her name is, this American living in Denmark, and she was saying how her kid did something wrong and she took away playtime. And the Danish parents were appalled. They were like, why would you do that? You shouldn't punish your kid. You should talk to your kid and you should explain. And she was like, get off my case.
Yeah.
This is how I do my parenting, right? But the idea of punishment is really outdated.
So interesting. And I guess every kid is different as well. Like my parents were always talking about when my brother and I were growing up, I was always the logical kid. If they said I couldn't do something, they would be like, you would always ask why. And we would have to explain like the why behind like why you couldn't do this thing. Whereas with your brother, we wouldn't explain why. We would just punish him and say, you can't do this if you do this. And the punishment was enough for him to understand, okay, I don't do that. But I was always, so maybe I have this like Swedish mentality deep down of wanting to understand the why behind things.
Yeah, I think it's cool, like when parents tell the kids why, because then you're not just like, because I told you so. Okay, that's not a good reason for why I shouldn't do that. But yeah, I think that's an interesting part. And I think the other thing that, of course, you know of, and this is probably more Danes than Swedes, it's the cold exposure.
Mm,
It's the idea of being outside. And I think that's why Scandinavians are so crazy about airing out the rooms and going out for walks when it's like, who is going to want to go out in this terrible weather, right? Like you don't want to
yeah.
go out, but there's so this idea of being outside is so ingrained in their life. And it comes with the cold exposure, like leaving the pram outside and just leaving it there and going in for coffee and letting the kid just lay outside. um, so I think it's, yeah, I think it's quite like a balanced way of raising kids.
Yeah, I've recently gotten to spend some time around Swedish kids, being with my girlfriend and her sister who has a 4-year-old daughter and a newborn. And so it's been very, very interesting for me to see their parenting style and like really, as you were saying, like allowing the kid to like figure things out on their own and like not being a helicopter parent, as we would say in the US, of like always standing over their shoulder and doing everything for them, but really giving them this sense of independence in a way where if they're trying to do something and they ask mom and dad to do it, well, they say, well, you can do it, and having them like develop this sort of independent mentality that they can do it on their own. So it's very, very interesting to see like the different parenting styles from culture to culture as well.
And have you noticed the difference in Swedish kids? Have you seen like that, they act differently?
In my experiences from teaching in the US and Sweden, like the grading system and how people are brought up basically through the school system. Americans are like tested like multiple choice questions, true, false, like a lot of these types of tests. Whereas in Sweden, it was a lot more open-ended and a lot more like essays and a lot more describing their experience. And whereas America, sort of, we put it in a box of like, this is the right answer, this is the wrong answer. Whereas it was like more of a spectrum in a way in the Swedish system, if that makes sense, which was
more nuanced,
sort of confusing as a teacher that had never gone through the Swedish school system myself, and then found myself teaching in this system. In America, you take a test, you get 9 out of 10 right, that's an A. You get 8 out of 10 right, that's a B. It's very cut and dry. And here it's like you have a range of different ways that you can view and grade. And especially in PE, the kids that were really athletic and everything, they might have an A in every category, but then they couldn't dance. So they couldn't get an A because they weren't up to the A level in dancing, for example. So the people that got A's most often in PE were girls that were athletic and could do all the physical things, but could also do the dancing. They could do the orienteering and basically going around and locating locations on the map and swimming and all of these things that were a part of the list. So it was a more well-rounded way of looking at the PE subject, I would say.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I find, when we were talking about sex in the other video, it's interesting the way that kids are introduced to sex. Like, it's in Denmark, especially, like I've heard that, all over Scandinavia, I would say, in the US, it's still kind of taboo. If you're a little kid, you'll be like, oh, this is your pee-wee and this is your whatever. You have little cute names for parts. And I remember reading an article of a woman saying like, well, why can't we name things the way they are? Like, what is different about these parts of our body that, we can't tell the kid, okay, this is what happens. This is how people have sex. And, I don't know if you've noticed this in Sweden, like the books that are sold to kids, teaching them about sex education. It's not the birds and the bees, right? Yeah, it's very explicit.
Very interesting. I remember going into the Stockholm library basically, and we were just going around with my mom because it's a beautiful building, and we were looking at all the artwork and the books everywhere. And then we ended up in the kids section somehow, and there was just a book sitting there out in the open, and it was like the complete sex book for kids, basically. And then we picked it up and was reading it and was like, wow, this is very, very detailed. But it was also great. I came from a background of like living in Germany for a little while when I was very young. So I was exposed to European openness around sex that was maybe not traditional for people that were growing up all their lives in America. So I had this sort of deeper founded appreciation for the Swedish approach to how they teach sex to the younger kids as a natural thing and nothing to be ashamed of. So it's quite interesting how they viewed it. But then obviously when I was thrown onto the other side of the equation as a teacher teaching sex ed in Sweden, I found it very awkward when we give all the kids clay and they're molding penises out of clay. Like, it was so surreal to me because in America that's like the first thing they'd tell you not to do as a teacher. Don't let the kids draw penises on anything or do anything like this. And here we're encouraging it in Sweden. It was such a surreal. And then we're hanging up the artwork they had made on the walls, every day I'm walking down the hallway of penises, basically on my way to the office. I was like, this would never happen in the U.S. It was
but
so
I also
surreal.
Wonder though, like, how did the kids react to that one? Because I can imagine American kids being like, yeah, I'm gonna make a big dick, like that. That's how they would approach that assignment. Like, I wonder if Swedish kids made the same jokes.
I think the level of maturity was probably a little higher in Sweden than I would have expected in the U.S., but there were still kids, a female teacher comes into the room to get some supplies and, hey, check out my, saying things like this. And so, of course, there's still a little bit about that, but there's something about the ability to just like laugh about it that sort of puts it into this just natural human experience. This is a normal thing. We can all laugh about it. But it's not a big taboo thing, basically. So I remember actually my sex ed experience when I must have been 10, 11 years old, and we were, the teacher puts the video on the screen, and they had separated all the boys and girls, actually. So the girls, they go to another room and they watch the girl video, and the guys, they stay in the room and they watch the video specifically for the guys, and it talks about your body's going to be going through changes and this and that. And I remember one of my friends was goofing off, so they sent him to the other room with the girls, and he had to watch the girls' video. And when they were sending him out, they had paused the screen right on a big picture of a penis, and we're all like 11, 12 years old. And I start laughing, and the teacher goes, "What do you think is so funny?" And I was like, "Well, you tell us all the time not to talk about the stuff, do anything, and now you just pause the screen. There's a big penis up there." So it was, but it was so interesting that like the American teachers had this like sensitivity around it. It's like, put the video up, don't ask any questions, let's just get through this. And in Sweden, it was so open. Like the first thing we did is bring all the kids in, and any question you have about sex, write it on the board, and the teacher's going to leave the room, and we'll come back and answer everything. And we're explaining to 12-year-olds what 69 and reverse cowgirl and all these things are.
Oh God!
And I'm like,
I as a former teacher, I'm in pain listening to this. Like, this is miserable. It's a horrible experience.
It was, yeah. I mean, luckily I was team teaching with one other teacher, but it was both of us were a little bit outside of our element for that week, I think.
But I think it's kind of cool. I mean, I like the idea that like kids have those questions anyways, and nowadays it's just a click away from seeing everything. So are you gonna learn about sex from porn, or you're gonna learn it from like an actual source? So I think that makes a difference for how they approach sex. Although I would have to say on the negative side of that, Scandinavia has some really high like rates of chlamydia. So whatever the kids are not doing right, I'm not sure, but yeah, protection is an issue.
It's interesting, and people do get tested a lot in Stockholm. And I remember my first time going in to get tested, and there's this huge stigma around STDs in the US. And I remember saying to the nurse, "I really, really hope I don't have anything." And she was basically like, "Yeah, if you have anything, it's no big deal. You come back, you take some pills, and you'll be fine in a week." And it was like their mindset around it. Like it was this huge negative thing in the US, and in Scandinavia, they're like, "Oh, it's just a part of life. If you get it, take some pills and you'll be better." And that was so like a weird reframe around this thing that I had heard as like the worst thing ever. And then to them, no big deal. It's sort of interesting that's probably why the rates are much higher here, because the stigma around it isn't as high as other places.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, the stigma around sex is definitely way less, and you can talk about it openly, and it's just something. Every time I would hang out with Scandinavians, like they have no issues with talking about their sex life. Like it's just kind of, especially like, I mean, I would say probably Danes I've had that experience with the most, but it's just a part of life, right? Like they don't think of it as something like to be swept under the carpet and locked up. So I think it starts with that, like learning about it in childhood, right? It's the way like your parents deal with it as well.
Yeah.
Like they're there if you have questions. They're not like, okay, no, ask your dad, or, so that's interesting.
Yeah. So if you guys want to hear us go more into depth about dating and sex specifically, be sure to check out our other video right here. But I do want to say, Marina, thanks for joining us. This was a lot of fun. I feel like we could talk about this stuff for hours.
Me too. Thanks for having me, Stefan. This was so much fun to talk about. It's so interesting.
Yeah. And don't forget to check out her book down below in the description, Sex Before Coffee. And we'll see you guys in another video.